Yuehan. So, Liu Laoshi, yeah. She is currently teaching at Chengdu Technology University. So we're very happy to, all of you are very happy to have her here. I'm also a visitor, so sharing your joy of visiting London. Your PhD was from Queen Mary University. Congratulations, coming back home. Your research focuses, according to the notes that prepared, the convergence of slow cinema. Interesting concept. Along with feminist film, minority representation, ecological aesthetics, as well as exploring how marginalized voices and non-human agents, there's a connection to Daoism there, expand our understanding of time, space, and existence. So quite a lot going on there. And the title of your talk, very appropriate, Forest Spirits and Tree Burials, revisiting animism and Daoism in Japanese cinema. So join me in welcoming Dr. Liu.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, David, for that introduction. Yeah, and I also want to say thank you to Kiki, who organized this amazing workshop and included me here. So I'm just going to start. Today I'd like to talk about forests, spirits, and burial in Japanese cinema, focusing particularly on Hayao Miyazaki and Naomi Kawase. Miyazaki is widely regarded as a global icon of animation, whose work has reached millions of viewers globally. Kawase is renowned for her first-person documentaries and fiction films that explore life and death through evocative depictions of nature and the people living in it. So, to understand their visions, we must look at a specific atmosphere of contemporary Japan. The nation has been navigating what Ulrich Beck calls a risk society, a concept applied to the Japanese context by scholar Shokoyama. This has been caused by successive ecological and man-made catastrophes in Japan, from the Minamata disease to the more recently the March 11th triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown. As Yoneyama argues, this state of being has also led to a crisis of imagination, where modern secular frameworks are no longer sufficient to offer a path toward healing. However, in a way, contemporary filmmaking has responded by reflecting these collective traumas, offering spaces for rethinking our kinship with the world and for the possibility of healing as well as well-being. So we see this most explicitly in the recent work of Makoto Shinkai. His disaster trilogy, Your Name, Weathering with You, and Suzume, serves as a direct map of this risk society. More specifically, Your Name deals with the trauma of sudden loss through the metaphor of a fragmented comet destroying a rural town, echoing the 2011 tsunami in Japan. And Weathering with You addresses the climate crisis through the depiction of endless abnormal rainfall flooding Tokyo. And Suzume directly engages with the scars of March 11th disaster as the protagonist travels across Japan to lock doors that prevent subterranean warmth from triggering devastating earthquakes. Shinkai's films engage with the tangible sorrow of catastrophe, the destruction of towns, the anxiety of permanent climate shifts, and the symbolic dose of trauma left by the 2011 earthquake. He captures the collective trauma of a nation living on unstable ground. While Shinkai focuses on the events of recent catastrophe, Miyazaki offers a critical perspective on the human role in environmental damage. In his films, Miyazaki consistently returns to the entanglement of humans with the natural world. In this work, there is always an unseen world where ancestors and the deceased share space with the living. As Yoneyama suggests, Miyazaki's work operates as a critical animism, an intervention that challenges anthropocentric views and reimagines nature as a non-dualistic combination of the life world and the spiritual world inhabited by non-human agencies. In this talk, drawing on animism and in Japan and Daoist thought, I examine the resonances between these cinematic visions and the lived practice of triburial. As researched by Sebastian Boret, triburial allows individuals to return to the forest, making the animist ideas we see on screen both visible and tangible in everyday life. To understand these resonances, we first ground ourselves in the cultural bedrock of the landscape. We cannot grasp why Miyazaki and Kawase turned to the forest as a site of healing, without first knowing the distinctive features of animism in Japan, starting with its fundamental identity as forest culture. So Japan is a forest country, with around 67% of its land covered by forests, and over half of which being natural forests, which is one of the highest forest cover rates in the industrialized world. Japanese scholar Umehara Takeshi describes the Japanese as forest people, whose spiritual imagination is shaped by life among forests and wooded landscapes. In this context, forests are not mere background scenery or resources. They are dwelling places of kami, which means spiritual presences and agents of the world. This is expressed in the concept and practice of Shinju Nori, which means sacred shrine forests. The sacred shrine groves surrounding Shinto shrines, which is central to Japanese animistic heritage. These groves function as living sites where humans, nature, and the spiritual realm intersect. They are often described as forests of life, preserving local ecosystems and acting as ecological refuges. Sometimes they are imagined as remnants of an earlier ecological golden age, associated with the Jomo period, where humans and spiritual forces are seen as coexisting closely. In this sense, forests actively shape ritual, memory, and sacred experiences in Japan. So this brings us to the relationship between animism and Shinto in Japan. Shinto literally meaning the way of the gods. Is defined as the indigenous faith of Japan, encompassing the mythology, ancestor worship, and nature reverence of Japanese people. Shinto can be understood as a historically developed expression of a deeper animistic worldview, embodying a radical personalization of the universe. In this view, spiritual forces, which are also called kami or tama, permeate all things. The boundaries between humans, ancestors, animals, plants, and even inanimate objects are fluid and interconnected. What is most relevant here is folk Shinto, a local and place-based practice that centers on the spiritual significance of specific environments. Unlike state Shinto, which abstracted and centralizes local practices during the Meiji periods, folk Shinto is embedded in everyday life, non-dogmatic and relational. It is this local grassroots animism that filmmakers like Miyazaki and Kawase are tapping into, a worldview where the sacred is found not in a distant heaven but in a specific tree or the local grove. With these features in mind, we can now better understand how animism in Japan has developed historically. In general, animism in Japan is understood as a life-world philosophy, a lived reality where life, nature, and soul are perceived as mutually entwined relational. The roots of animism in Japan extend back to the prehistoric Jomo period. This era is often described as a kind of forest civilization where humans, animals, and natural elements were understood as part of a shared spiritual network. Spiritual vitality, described as tama, was believed to circulate across beings, and the dead were not absent but continued to participate in the world through natural forms such as trees and stones. The forest was central. Trees were sacred, rivers were alive, and even rocks could hold spiritual agency. Tree worship and forest-based rituals were pervasive, forming the foundation of what would later become Shinto practices. Life and death were perceived as a porous continuum embedded in everyday interactions with an environment. And during the Edo period, these ideas were further articulated through the movement of Kokugaku, or national learning. Thinkers like Hirata Atsutei sought to recover what they saw as indigenous Japanese spiritual knowledge, removing the layers of Buddhist and Confucian influence that had accumulated over centuries. They emphasized the coexistence of the visible world and the unseen realm inhabited by kami and ancestral spirits. A major shift occurred during the Meiji period. As Japan underwent rapid modernization, the state sought to reorganize spiritual life along more centralized and rational lines. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marks a radical pivot toward a false disenchantment. This involved both the suppression of local animist practices and their transformation into a national ideology through stateship. Local spirits tied to forests, rivers, and villages were abstracted into symbols of imperial authority. In this process, the intimate, place-based relationships central to animism were weakened or redirected. The animistic core was not entirely raised, but was instead dematerialized. Spirits were redirected away from trees, rivers, and rocks, and toward the dignity of the emperor and the heroic spirits of fallen soldiers. This shift represents a profound rupture, a severing of the living organic connection between the Japanese people and their local landscapes. However, this transformation was never complete. Animistic sensibilities persisted in folk rituals, rural shrines, and the collective memory of local communities. These beliefs retained their relational and ecological logic, and in the late 20th century, these ideas began to re-emerge, particularly in response to the failures of industrial modernity and the growing ecological awareness of post-industrial Japan. Rather than disappearing, animism in Japan adapted and resurfaced in new forms. So this brings us to a shift in contemporary scholarship. In her research on animism in Japan, Shoko Yoneyama proposes the paradigm of critical animism. To serve as a response to ecological and social crisis, critical animism is born from within modernity to critique its self-destructive tendencies. It uses intangible cultural heritage to challenge anthropocentric assumptions. Specifically, Yoneyama identifies Miyazaki as one of the four key Japanese intellectuals who articulated a critical animism as a grassroots response to the social environmental crisis of modernity. In films like My Neighbor Totoro, the sacredness of the forest is anchored in locality rather than tied to institutionalized religion. For instance, the magnificent kafa tree is protected by a Shimenawa rope, signifying that the tree itself, rather than man-made shrine next to it, is an actual sacred place. The forest acts as a portal where the mundane world and the unseen world connect on a continuous surface. In Princess Mononoke, Miyazaki explores the sometimes violent aspects of this relationship. Spirits like the Kodama or the Shishigami are not more or mere religious symbols. They're manifestations of unseen life itself, a vitalistic force that watches from the shadows and acts as an independent agent. The film portrays the Shishigami as both the giver and taker of life, embodying a nature that refuses to be domesticated. In this sense, by making nature and spirituality central features, Miyazaki's work enacts a critical animism that transforms what was once considered primitive into a radical postmodern philosophy. As Yoneyama highlights, this worldview is summarized by the profound realization that, quote, our God inhabits even a single leaf and the smallest insect, unquote, which are the words from Nausicaa, from Miyazaki's film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. His films open ways of thinking human-on-human relationships, treating nature not as a resource for extraction, but as a living spiritual companion necessary for survival in the Anthropocene. In the works of Miyazaki, we encounter worlds where forests are not passive settings, but vibrant fields of agency. These animistic sensibilities find a physical expression in the contemporary Japanese practice of triburial. Triburial in the contemporary Japanese involves burying cremated remains under living trees rather than within traditional stone graves. As Sebastian Boret observes, by returning remains to the soil, triburial transforms death into a participatory process. The deceased nourish the earth, turning the cemetery into a space for the regeneration of life rather than a place of static decay. Triburial also addresses a shift in Japanese society, the move away from the traditional patrilineal family grave system. Historically, individuals without descendants to maintain a family plot risks becoming unbotoke, which means rootless or unattached spirits who receive no ritual care and are potentially stigmatized as dangerous or bad deaths. Tree burial can reinterpret this rootlessness as a form of liberation. By choosing a communal forest, the individual is freed from rigid familial obligations and join a rootless yet ecological and communal collective. This resonates with both animist and Daoist sensibilities. Humans remain connected to a living presence while dissolving individual identity into broader natural rhythms. Well-being emerges through participation, release, and relational presence rather than legacy or ownership. Triburial serves as a physical intersection where animism in Japan Daoist philosophy resonates to think about life and death from an animistic perspective. A central concept in Triburial is ecological immortality, where lost life is sustained through the vibrant life of the forest. As Burris observes, adherents are drawn to the idea of rejoining the cycle of nature and being reborn as an element of nature, such as a flower growing from their burial sites. The tree therefore serves as a dwelling place for the spirit, providing a tangible anchor and a deep connection with the natural world. Complementing this is Daoist philosophy centered on qi or vital energy that passes through the whole world. In this view, life and death are not absolute opposites but transformations within a continuous cosmic cycle. The body's qi disperses into roots and leaves, which resonates with the Taoist ideal of dissolving the rigid, fixed identity into the broader, non-dualistic rhythms of nature. Well-being comes not from maintaining boundaries, but from participating in the ongoing flow. If Miyazaki represents the mythic scale of animism, Naomi Kawase brings these philosophies to life through the intimate and the everyday. In the morning forest, a young caregiver and an elderly man wander through a dense forest to locate a triburial grave. The forest is a living participant. In this film, slow camera work and narrative rhythm create a contemplative space where time flows with the wind and the leaves. When protagonist Shigeki rests against a tree marking his wife's grave, it acts as an intermediary, physically and emotionally linking human grief with the ongoing vitality of nature. In Sweet Bean, this is presented more explicitly. The character Tokue, who lived isolated from society due to leprosy, is a personification of Moon Botoke, the rootless spirit. After her passing, a cherry tree is planted in her memory by her friends with the same seed. When the protagonist Sentaro touches its leaves, the film demonstrates transcendent communication, emphasizing relational continuity. The deceased proceeds through nature's process. Through shots of sunlight, wind blowing leaves and blossoms, Kawase visualizes Tokue's ongoing presence through qi, illustrating the Taoist understanding of life and death. For Kawase, healing and well-being are not about conquering loss but living in dialogue with it, alongside memory and the non-human world. In both cultural practice and cinematic representation, Triburial embodies a profound resonance between animism and Daoism. This intersection transforms death from static endpoint into a dynamic process of becoming. Kawase's work makes this fusion tangible by capturing the intimate presence of transformation in the everyday, where Miyazaki's forests visualize the animate and spiritual continuity of nature on a mythic scale. Together, this work embodies Uneyama's critical animism. This work view challenges the modern dichotomy between the human and the non-human. It offers a response to our current crisis of imagination. By recognizing the divine in even a single leaf and acknowledging the qi that flows between ancestors and the earth, we can imagine ways of living responsibly within the Anthropocene. In this light, well-being shifts from narrow confines of lineage and ownership toward a state of release and immersion. Thank you.
So, questions? Please, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me again. Yeah. So, Rob, since you first, had your talk, so I'm really interested in, Chloe Zhao Ting and her film and Daoism because I watched a few of her films. I kind of agree with you what you have said in your talk. My question is actually the case you didn't explore more in that talk. The recent Hamlet. And in Hamlet, I think the human natures, the their connection or the relationship changed a bit. I actually wanted to know what do you think, yeah.
Yeah, I want to know what I think too. I have planned writing a chapter on Hamlet for a book on Chloe Zhao, which is coming out. I'm currently reading the book, which is tremendous. I just bought the Blu-ray, and I need to get more into it. I've seen it once, and it literally took my breath away. The final sequence stopped me breathing, and I realised I wasn't breathing because of what happens in that sequence. The character of Agnes is, of course, fascinating, and in the book she's slightly different. She's a lot more knowing in the book than she is in the film. In the book, she's very aware of kind of destiny and fate, and she understands all of the children must die. In the film, I don't think it's that clear. But I think in the book especially, I think the character of Agnes seems to have this a profound sense of interconnectedness. It separates her from the rest of the world around her. All people are evolving very, very quickly forwards, but she seems to be regressing, which is why people refer to her as a witch, and things like this, and why she's known for the natural potions, and why she heads off to the woods to give birth once, then tries again. I need to look more into it, and I think it's really fascinating. I haven't really come to any conclusions yet. What do you think?
I think my question could be more specific to what do you think of the cameraman in the film?
Okay.
Reshape the Taoist connection. Because for the previous films, I think it's her boyfriend and doing this fabulous thing. But to be honest, personally, I don't like the cameraman in Hamlet, and also probably I don't like the ratio, the frame ratio because it's like more narrow rather than the wide one. You can feel the natural more.
Yes. I'm going to have to get back to you on this. I'm really sorry, but I think the way that Agnes is played in film, and I think the ratio adds to it, it's kind of unifying, because if it were a constantly widescreen, you would be aware of perhaps a disjunction between the landscape or something which exists beyond her. And if it's a square ratio, I think it's much more about her immersion in that landscape. I mean, there is at least one incredible shot where she's discovered curled up in the roots of the tree. And it's very much about a sense of unity. And I do think if it were, if that shot, for example, had been widescreen, she would simply be a human figure positioned in the landscape instead of part of the landscape. But you're going to have to let me watch it again and finish the book.
Okay.
And get back to you, maybe.
I'm looking forward to reading that.
Okay, so am I.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Other questions? Please, in the back, yeah.
Yes, question for Rob.
Oh.
I was wondering if you can relay your notion of how you're using the term transcendence, maybe more, especially in the context of immanence and Daoism. So, as I understood it, you use transcendence as synthesis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm using it in the way that Emerson and Thoreau and others use it. So I'm trying to understand their understanding rather than provide my own or provide a more holistic or universal idea of it. Their idea of transcendence was certainly the synthesis that comes from a Hegelian dialectic. So you live your life and you think your way through that life in terms of contradictions. At the end of it, there is a synthesis, which for Emerson was a kind of perfectionism, which he would always be working towards. This for him was the imagined life. There would be sometime the possibility of perfection, even though deep down in his writing he admits, so does Thoreau and others, that perfection is essentially unattainable. It still becomes a moral objective, and as a moral objective which they are obliged to act upon, it's something that therefore shapes their lives. But I think crucially to the transcendentalists, transcendence wasn't something to be achieved beyond death. Transcendence wasn't being lifted up or awakening in heaven after death. Transcendence for them was this sense of assuming a moral duty and complying with that to the extent that you became someone who was entirely self-reliant and who used that self-reliance for the benefit of the community. So transcendence for the transcendentalists is this. It's this synthesis, which for them is the imagined end, the imagined perfection of an entire life lived according to the contradictions that they perceive. That's how I see it. So, for example, I start the book by saying this has nothing to do with Paul Schrader and his ideas of transcendental film style. It's nothing to do with that at all. That's a very different thing, which, you know, Schrader comes back to and says, okay, I was wrong. What I was talking about was actually slow cinema. That's a very different thing. Transcendence has nothing to do with transcendental film style in the Schrader sense. Transcendence is this sense of a life well lived, and a life well lived according to moral principles, which can be extrapolated to form a more universalistic sense of the world as well. So it's very specific to Emerson and Thoreau and others. It's not a definition that I impose upon them. It's a definition that I draw out from their own writings on what that might be. Is that okay?
Very good. Yes.
It's just an observation to add to that. It's worth putting that into context, that American transcendentalism is part of that American experience of coming from a corrupt, decadent Europe into the possibility of a new Eden.
Yes.
And that's, in my world, you know, that gets expressed in luminist paintings, yes, and Hudson River School paintings, then later on Agnes Martin, certain aspects of abstract expressionism.
I think there's a difference with the Hudson School, because there was a notion of the sublime there that was to be represented, and the transcendentalists didn't see the sublime as something which was pictorial or to be admired from beyond. It wasn't kind of, we're in the presence of God. For them, the sublime was not in the grand vistas of the paintings of Albert Bierstadt and others. The sublime was in the tiniest details, getting your fingers with.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
But the whole point was that the American landscape, in all its forms, was sublime.
Yes.
And that wasn't something to be stood back from. That's something to inhabit, as you rightly describe it. The point I was going to make is that, you know, as well as there being other pictorial traditions that your argument pertains to, I was very interested in this idea of the thwarted imagination. And I wonder if you'd say something about the relationship between that and the disappointment of not being able to enter into the new Eden.
Yeah.
Is that transcendentalism fails, and it fails because America just becomes another corrupting society that destroys its native peoples, or at least pushes them back,
I think it
coats the base with industrialism. And I wonder, yeah, whether these films that you point out, which a lot of which I've seen, there is an inherent disappointment in to do with this thwarting of the imagination.
Yeah, certainly, absolutely. But then again, as you see in many of those films, the characters are aware of, you know, lives of quiet desperation. That's what I would call them. This is what they live. But at the same time, you have characters in films like Flacker and Clark's and Sorry Baby, Madland, all of these, who, despite knowing that, despite all that, still strive towards some sense of meaning, which is constructed out of this dialectic that I was referring to before. And I also think it's a sense of, as you say, you go back a few centuries, and this idea of, you know, the new world, and it's a hugely complicated subject, and it's to do with, again, taking this idea of the life, the intra-history, the life of the individual, but applying that as an example for the rest of the new world, applying that to the rest of America. So Thoreau going to Walden Pond is kind of doing it on behalf of everybody else. If I can do this, this could be a model. If I go to jail for a night for not paying my taxes, this becomes a model for further behaviour. And so again, it's like with Fuller as well, writing a feminist manifesto, and then working with prostitutes in prisons. It wasn't enough just to have an abstract idea. It wasn't enough to subscribe to religion. What was essential was to decide what is a moral imperative and then work towards it. And what they attempted to do, I think, was apply this not just to themselves, although that's obviously the first thing they did,
Society.
but then they applied it to society as a whole. To say that transcendentalism failed, I wouldn't go along with that. I mean, for example, transcendentalists were essential to abolitionism. Now, the fact that Thoreau and Emerson and others, Bronson Alcott particularly, stood up and spoke on behalf of abolitionism, in a sense, for want of a better word, kind of dignified something and turned it into a very potent, very eloquent political discourse, and contributed massively to, the actual abolitionism, to the extent that following the Civil War, transcendentalism had become so identified with abolitionism that it's a spent force.
But it's no longer the idealism of the New Eden, particularly in the post-countercultural context,
Maybe
where
we save that for the coffee break.
Yeah.
all of that is in
We only have
compromised.
3 minutes left, so we would like to invite questions
We'll
from
have
our
coffee.
other two speakers, if there are any.
Yeah, I've got a question for Matt. And thanks for all papers. I really enjoyed that. I really want to go back to your point and help me follow Faye's thought here. You were talking in relation to the ideal realm that she wants to, and de-selfing, she wants to get rid of herself as an imposing and distorting presence. And I'm curious if that sort of that unsubjectification or whatever that might be is. I'm interested. You said it was a metaphor for art, but I always imagine that the artist is an important mediator rather than a vanished mediator. And I'm curious about how you made that connection. It sounded really interesting, and I was too stupid to follow.
According to Faye, she bases the artist on the ultimate creator, God, and for her, God is a vanishing creator. So God literally retreats from the world. So creation is an act of contractual retreat for the artist. Now, in practical terms, are you asking?
No, that's why I wondered. So is she kind of like is it a sort of platonic idea in a way, like that we shouldn't really read art is beautiful enough without?
I think the idea is to abolish personal perspective, which is kind of what we've discussed a lot today, and she imagines it in spatial terms. The artist or God has to move out of the way to allow something to be on its own terms, autonomous, and then she tries to apply that to perception, and how do you move out of the way and perceive things as they are, without imposing your own wishes, dreams, wishful thinking, illusions. It's a very difficult thing to do, and she proposes the practice of attention, a kind of a daily practice, or practice that you have to keep at it in order to kind of train yourself, in order to try and get out of the way. Of course, it's a kind of thankless endeavor, maybe, because there's an impossibility at the heart of it, obviously. And in her case, and maybe this is in difference to Daoism, in her case, there's a self-violence involved in decreation. She did die very young, and I don't want to lecture into biographical gossip or anything like that, but it's there is a kind of violence in the way she imagines removing herself from the scene. So that's there too, but I think the task, is a very beautiful one, and is achieved by works of art that manage to see in a different way that isn't simply the projection of one's own ego. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, you can talk more during coffee. Final question, quickly, please.
I've got a question for Yuehan, actually. And it's very interesting that you mentioned the trade burial as a Japanese folklore stuff. And actually, my question is a bit of methodology. That how would you justify your Taoist intervention in that kind of folklore stuff instead of a Buddhist or combined the two that I totally understand that you might not be able to include everything in your presentation, but if it's writing or if it's that to PhD dissertation something, how would you like deal with that kind of philosophical entanglements of these like Asian philosophies like Buddhism, Daoism, local like thinking campaigns, and would you literally just trace back to historical documents to see, okay, there's a book talking about like trade burial in, for example, 18th century, or would you just literally include like Buddhist discussions in your humanities of that kind of stuff?
Thank you for the question. So the tributary that I discussed in my talk is basically about like emerged in 1990s. But I think, as you mentioned, that there are maybe like more spaces to explore than the historical traces of tutorial and how it resonates across East Asia, maybe in China, in Korea, in India. But those are things that I haven't included in this talk. But I think that you've mentioned a very interesting field that needs to be explored further. That answers the question. Thank you.
So thanks again to our three speakers. We're a bit behind.